So the panel discussion entitled Crisis Management, and the moderator is dear friend to me, Robert Rea. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
Right, mate.
Good afternoon. For me, this is a real pleasure and an honour to be asked to come and work or chair this panel. We're joined this afternoon by Carlo Laveri, who is the Business Continuity Manager for Emirates Steel, which I had some pleasure to work with. Now, you'll recognise the next person that I'm going to call up is Pete Stevenson, who doesn't look like James Grew. James Grew, unfortunately, is taken ill today. So Peter, who joined the fire service with me back in 1982, is going to stand in for him. And then last but by no means least is another gentleman I've worked with when we were associated with the New Dimension programme, is Duncan White, Managing Editor of the International Fire and Safety Journal. So welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. What I want to try and do is set the scene. If we look through the day today, we've seen that pretty well as a theme that crisis management is in most of the presentations we've looked at. When we've looked at sustainability, and Pete talked about going back to basics, we can see that actually links into when we start thinking about the development of a crisis management plan. And that's kind of what I want to try and get these gentlemen to share their experiences and their thoughts with you about the development of a crisis plan. And we're going to look at it through the 4 stages: the prevention, the preparation, the response, the recovery. And then there's other elements as we talk through. I'm going to try and draw them out from there. So what I want to do first off is, with Pete being in his area of speciality with regards to the fire safety side of stuff, look at the prevention. Pete, how did you see prevention really being the opener for crisis management?
You mentioned basics again, Bob. You've got to start looking what is the risk. So applying something like NFPA 1300, doing a community risk assessment, which then leads into the crisis reduction plan. So understanding the risks, understanding who are the stakeholders. The interesting discussion to do with the rail infrastructure. I was actually a fire engineer for Network Rail. On a typical station in London, you would have up to 34 stakeholders. And it's always very, very important as part of the preparation and planning to get the stakeholders, understand their risks, understand the building users, what are their issues, and then feed that into the emergency plans, etc.
Carlo, building on from there.
Yeah, I'm on the same page. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. Actually, I'm from a different domain, so I'm on risk management, business continuity, and information security. This is my domain. So I'm out of this group of people. Anyway, yes, prevention. Prevention is, let's say, 80% of my job every day. The risk assessment in my company is the key point to try to be as much as resilient we can. Managing business continuity, the initial part of understanding what we do, doing a good risk assessment, and be prepared is the key then to try to avoid incident and emergency. We have a governance where emergency management is owned by health and safety. So the health and safety department is managing all the kind of incident till the emergency. When a crisis happens, so when we are over the appetite of the emergency, then I will be back. I am back on stage managing the crisis. But we try to do our best to avoid the point of reaching the crisis, because you never know what can happen. and anything can be behind the door, and the door is closed at the moment when the emergency happens. So risk assessment is a major point, and working for every manufacturing industry, we are also very much involved in trying to find workarounds and understanding what can be done to avoid major emergencies.
That leads me into you, Duncan, really, when you think about where you were working with the New Dimension programme, and that expanded outside an individual organisation. Have you something you could add to Carlo's?
Well, yeah, I think the importance with crisis management and testing of processes, and it is all very well having the response capability, but the answer is not putting the response capability as your primary route to dealing with it. A lot of the time, by testing, preparedness, and putting in place robust training packages will ensure that a crisis may well be able to be averted if you've got a number of trigger points within your planning process. So rather than waiting to see something going totally wrong, if there are a number of trigger points that will put in place early intervention, then a lot of the time the response, the heavy weight of the response, which should only be seen as a last resort, may not well be required.
I agree, and I think we can all accept the fact that that's the prevention is the key, and then leading into how do we prepare to prevent? And as you alluded to, it's about the training and preparation of our staff. So you alluded to the response, and how do we identify what weight of response that we need to apply? Pete?
Again, assessing the risk, and there's certain processes that you can adopt. I mentioned the community risk assessment and the risk reduction plan, but there's very solid guidance in documents, NFPA 1710. If you assess your risk, you can then see the weight of response, the resources you require, the equipments, etc. So there is a long storyline just in that simple exercise of the risk assessment.
And Carlo, leading on from that, we can identify what stakeholders, and you can see from your industry where the different stakeholders form part of your response plan.
You know, exercising is the key word. I always say that there is a magic formula of crisis management, which is basically 3 words: exercise, exercise, and exercise. Nothing else than exercise. Also because the stakeholders that you have to involve during a crisis are different. Just make an example, what happened during the latest pandemic. So we were not prepared. Nobody was prepared. And if you said that you were prepared, I cannot believe you, because nobody was prepared. But we were quite good in some scenarios planning, like lack of people. The lack of people has been perfect for the crisis that happened. But after this, we had to involve many other stakeholders that were not in the picture before, like the CFO. The CFO was heavily involved because he had to put money on the table, and then the communication manager, because communication has been a key point, because people was not able to communicate properly. You know, we are producing steel. 80% of our employees doesn't have access to IT because they use screwdrivers. And communication has been one of the major issues because we were not able to communicate properly among the company. So even creating the bubbles was a problem because you could not move people properly in and out. But this is just to give you an example. Why we were successful? Because we tested the lack of people scenario and we were able to do this. But when we go into the full picture of crisis management exercise, then you have to think on out of the box. You have to think of who are the stakeholders that can be and must be part of the picture that normally are not in the scenario where you test when you do business continuity. So CFO, just to make an example, but the crisis management, the crisis communication was a key point, but also human capital in terms of people helping others on surviving, and even the families, because we got also to manage the families. Now, I have the example of a pandemic, but the next one will be maybe tomorrow, coming from somewhere else, but it was a very good example and a very good lesson learned for the future. I'm not sure that I answered your question, but
no, I think you did. Well, you opened another door, really, which I suppose at the end of the day is my job to find that door and open it and then pursue it. So you identified communication was the big challenges. Yeah. And when we look at any preparedness plan, it's the 5 W's, the what, the where, the how, the and who. So right early on, when Captain Issa, he spoke about the AI that had been developed by DCD and the way that they've created the app that they can actually communicate in the languages of the nationalities that are receiving it. Is that something that you potentially looked at as well?
Yes, 100%. Yeah, yes. Different languages, you know, I'm British, English is not my first language, so I'm one of the key.
I'm trying to slow down.
Please. Yes, especially in this part of the world, it's a key point. It's a key point. But not only for the language, it's also for the different culture and the different approach, different behaviors, different appetite in understanding and listening, which is different. Can be completely different among the kind of people that is working in the organization, and communication in and out was also. It's also very important. So I'm putting a lot of pressure now on our communication manager to create a proper crisis communication plan, because this is needed, and I'm sure that sooner or later we will need it again, and I would like to be very prepared next time.
Definitely. And actually picking up on Duncan, one of the challenges that we had with the New Dimension program, which was a national program, is the cross-border working. And those that understand the UK Fire and Rescue Service, Berkshire don't talk to Oxfordshire, Oxfordshire don't talk to Buckinghamshire, and we had to overcome that as well. So how do we manage that?
With great difficulty, I think, if the honest answer. I think if we were brutally honest, we would need a crisis plan for not having a crisis plan and not having a communications plan. There are still a lot of silo working going on between UK Fire and Rescue Services. We are 40-odd individual fire and rescue services, but in the end, once we'd put those individual personalities to one side, individuals wanting to be higher up the pecking order than others, and we sat down and really put it in, it goes straight back to, by putting in place an effective training and refresher program, ensured that the crews who were responsible for dealing with the mobilization of what were at the time national assets, ensured that they came in effect under a single entity for the period that they were taking place in a national response. And by taking them out of their individual fire and rescue service, took away those internal communication challenges and placed it all in one spot with the National Coordination Centre.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to allude to there is different processes, different approaches fit different needs. So it's important for each individual organisation to develop their own plan by risk assessing, identifying the stakeholders, and how do I work that through. So that was kind of what I was looking at from there. I think we achieved that. Okay, so let's look at, we've talked about different elements of training. What do we see training doing, Pete?
Well, I'd just quickly like to pick up on the silo scenario, because that really is a big problem within design, the built environment, etc. And that then can morph into training. You know, if you've not got a full understanding of the risks and what the objectives are, someone's perception of a crisis might be different to someone else's. There might be a financial issue, it could be a life safety issue, could be an environmental issue. So you've got to have the training meeting the risk as well, so to cover all the bases. And break your silos.
Break the silos, most definitely. But as the training sort of bridges across the preparedness and the response, because obviously if you're not trained, you can't respond effectively. And obviously with Carlo, there's a tiered response that you have at Emirates Steel. How do you see that working?
Yes, it's working. However, we have to be very honest with ourselves. So we cannot be prepared, we cannot respond to everything. This is practically impossible. There is also a mathematical theorem behind this. So being prepared for everything is not possible. So we need to think in terms of scenarios, and focusing on scenarios. But even when you focus on a scenario, you need to think out of the box and to think about the context where you are living in. Just make you an example. We did a kind of simulation, tabletop simulation on the possible closure of a Strait of Hormuz. This was a couple of years ago. Everybody in this room can understand what could be the consequences of closing the Strait of Hormuz. The first approach was, easy. Let's move our intake of raw material to Fujairah or to the other port on the other side. Easy to say, Then we discovered that if you do this, then you go into a kind of level of approvals to go on the other side. Because if the Strait of Hormuz is closed, then importing the raw material for making steel is the last that will be allowed to enter, because you have food, you have medicine, you have many other things. This is just to make you an example. So even if you think about scenarios, if you think on risk assessment, you think about your context, if you are not considering yourself as part of the bigger picture, then all your plans in terms of crisis management is at risk of failure, because there are other elements that you need to take under consideration. So think as in the context on the business that you are working in is the first point. So our recovery is working. Yes, is working. But the let's say the unknowns are always to be considered as part of the picture.
Yeah, and I think what you're alluding to is something that was brought up by Sinclair in his consciously competent session earlier on today, where we look at both individual or personal competence and organisational competence. What do you think about that, Duncan?
Well, it's interesting one where you compare the two, and whether you're comparing like for like, and you can have an extremely competent individual or group of individuals that are very prepared and have in place a very good plan for their area of expertise, or depending, it could well be a department within an organisation. I think the issue comes, and I refer back to silos, that the whole issue is that very often what you see is that rather than all the departments playing their little piece into the jigsaw that comes into the overall plan, sometimes, and I've said before that an individual's competence is hampered by an organisation's arrogance. And I think what we see in a lot of occasions is an organisation that says, we've got no issues. And when issues do arise, they're more interested in burying the issues than sharing the findings. And by sharing those findings, we're working towards allowing others to take on board the learning practice, take on board areas that need improving. But I would say organisational competence is more than just the competence of individuals. There's a need to look at the bigger picture and take the stakeholders on board. If as an organisation, part of your ability to provide your services relies on third-party stakeholders, and those third-party stakeholders aren't competent themselves, can you say that your whole organisation is competent? So a lot of known knowns and a lot of unknown knowns, but I think that it's getting across that crisis management is common sense. It's about sitting down, breaking it down into the individual parts and looking at it in the small parts, which will make it easier to deal with.
Okay. How do you think we could overcome some of that organisational competence development?
It needs to be driven from the top of the organisation. Mm-hmm. I'm a firm believer that a leader of an organisation is at the bottom, supporting the inverted pyramid, because very often they see themselves sitting at the top of the organisation looking down, which really and truthfully doesn't give a good picture of what they're seeing. So to have the ability for the whole organisation to sign up to the need to provide initial learning, maintain that knowledge and understanding, and test that on a regular basis will ensure that an open and honest organisation, when things don't go quite right, won't be in a position to point at one particular department. if there's an issue, it should be a shared issue.
Yeah. So currently you're looking at a charismatic leader, somebody that can carry an organisation forward with the vision and the drive to get the organisation to where it needs to be. Probably getting close to winding up time. One of the methods that you can use for achieving that is multi-departmental training. How do you feel about that, Carla?
No, I would say that it would be the final goal is to reach a kind of unconscious competence, like when we drive the car. We are competent without knowing that we are competent, so we're ready to manage it, even if there's something wrong with driving the car. But I'm sorry, say again the question, because I was thinking.
Basically, how do you think we can get an organisation through multi-department interworking to become competent in their crisis management planning?
The only recipe is to make them understanding that crisis management is the baseline of resiliency. If you are not, if you are not competent in managing crisis, the organization has a risk of not surviving. So training and exercising again. There are not many other things that can be done, and having people that is committed to the life of the organization. So it's part of let's say the bigger picture of the full organization, not thinking to themselves only. So making the department exchanging information, talking to each other, testing even small things, but having proper exchange of information, exchange of experience. This is the only way to survive when you have a crisis.
Super, thank you. We've reached time because the figures have all gone red at the bottom there. So I want to just try and draw things together just very, very briefly. So for an organisation to be competent, it needs to train and test. And testing and training doesn't have to be expensive. It can be done with very simplistic methods where you get groups of people sitting together, shared experiences, shared knowledge, and as Terry was saying earlier on, sharing the values. When you sit and talk, you debrief and you learn from each other. So shared knowledge within an organisation is very important. Because what that will do is that will help build your organisation's resilience and it will protect its reputation. And the key thing from crisis management is business continuity, business resilience, and protecting organisational reputation. Because if the organisation loses its reputation, then it fails. I'd like to thank my panel for their time.
Thank you, sir.